Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming inside when we'd all rather be outside on a beautiful sunny afternoon. I just want to welcome you to this special seminar. We don't typically have seminars this time of the day or even this day of the week. So it's a great pleasure to have our friend and colleague Frank Gasperini here as the speaker at our special seminar. Just a little background on Frank is that he has both a bachelor's and master's degree in agriculture. His first job was actually as an agricultural educator in high school. He also has an MBA from the School of Management at Keller in Chicago. And he is a certified association executive where he's known for his work in leadership and management, strategic planning, coalition building, negotiations, and advocacy. And so he is very much tuned into all of that with his job as the Executive Director, Executive VP, and CEO of the National Council of Ag Employers based out of Washington, D.C. So he came in today here for a number of reasons. He's an advisor to a number of our projects. He's also on the board of directors of the Agricultural Safety and Health Council of America. And some of the things that he does that makes him well known in agriculture is that he provides a weekly electronic update to all of his members about what's going on in Washington that has implications for the agriculture industry in terms of policy, immigration, this type of thing. And we know him also because he writes, I don't know if it's monthly or quarterly, the news column for the Vegetable Growers News, which is a widely read publication in the industry that has a lot of employees. So this is Frank's first time to Marshfield, and we're really pleased to have you here, and I'll hand over the podium to you. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to visit Marshfield. Finally, I've heard about it. I'm going to have a hard time not touching these microphones. Please don't slap my hands. There's a little sign, do not touch or adjust, but I'll try not to. But I've heard a lot about Marshfield. I actually met Matt Kiefer 10 years ago, and it was before he was at Marshfield and before I knew what Ashka was. But this is a special place. You're well known around the country by a lot of people. I hope that you'll become more well known by a lot more people in agriculture, because I think you're almost a secret that we need to get even more well known. But I've followed what you're doing for 15 years or so. I met Matt Kiefer before he was your director, and well before I was with NCAE, and I think it was 2001 or 2, probably 2, that we were paired opposite each other on a panel in Crystal City. And Matt and I weren't supposed to like each other. We were supposed to fight and take these opposing positions and beat each other up, and we kind of became friends. And it worked out really well, and I still consider Matt a friend. But I think what that really says, that's a testament to the fact that educated people of goodwill, if they'll talk and listen to one another, they can work through a lot of issues together and don't always have to come out adversaries. And sometimes seeming adversaries in agriculture can do great things together to make the world, the environment, and people's safety and health a better thing. And that's what's important. That's one of the issues that we fight in Congress all the time. People won't work together. We want to jump on the opposite side, and it's them and those people, and that's not productive. So through the Farm Medicine Center, through Ashka in particular, I've also gotten to know Barb Lee very well, and Kathy, and Scott, and Joe Mazza's not here. He's retired, but I've gotten to know a number of you and look forward to getting to know a lot more of you a lot better. I've been engaged in agriculture since 1973 when I got out of one of those almost square state universities. I guess Wisconsin and Ohio are not that huge enemies, so I can say I went to Ohio State. And that was a long time ago, but I was an agronomist at the time. And I went into agronomy to feed the world, so it colors everything I think about in business and in my professional life. And I'll talk about things being the right thing to do. And one of the things that we'll get more into is this whole idea of feeding 9.7 billion people, which is what the world's going to have by 2050. The write-up here said 9, and I went and Googled it, and they're actually saying 9.7 now. unless we have major famine or lots more disruption, which we hope we don't, versus 7.2 billion people in the world now. That's a big gap because there are hungry people in the world now. There are some of us who are better fed than we need to be, but in general, there isn't enough food in a lot of places in the world, and it's going to get worse because the population growth will be more in those places that already have food and security issues. So last year, well, I think that North American farmers, U.S. and North American farmers, have to be a piece of this. I think the write-up said they want to be, and that's true. They want to be part of feeding this 9.7 billion people, but they have to be. They must be, because we have the geopolitical stability, or have had, and hope we will continue to have, to be able to produce food, store it, process it, store it, transport it, and get it around the world. We have the resources of water and land and infrastructure more than a lot of the other countries that are food deficit. And so if North America doesn't play a huge role in producing for this 9.7 billion people, I don't see us making that goal. I just don't see that we can reach the goal of feeding 9.7 billion people. Now, last year at about this time, I spoke to a group in D.C. that was kind of an activist group, and they were talking about a lot of young and minority farmer issues, and I basically said this and was attacked by one of the people in the audience. How dare you say that American farmers have to produce the food for the world? And the person told me that that was elitist, it was Eurocentric and imperialistic and colonial. But the fact is, with the resources we have and looking at other countries where there's not food, it's unlikely that the rest of the world has any big enough places in one spot to grow the food for the world. We'll talk a little bit about food. I'll talk more about food. When I talk about food, I'm generally talking about the foods that we eat directly. I know that corn and soybeans are food, but corn and soybeans in a bigger way are feed and industrial feedstocks and energy supply, and there's a lot of that goes into food, but there's a difference, and I'll talk about some of the different kinds of agriculture, because one of the dilemmas that I have as the executive of National Council of Ag Employers, that we have as ASHCA, that I know you have as Marshfield Clinic in the National Ag Medicine Center, that we've talked about, is the different sizes of farmers, the different kinds of things they produce, as well as geography, because there are very different segments of agriculture in the U.S., and they're all reached very differently because they have different needs. The segment that I represent is labor-intensive agriculture, and I guess even though we continue to increase technology, there's a huge difference between somebody growing blueberries or apples or somebody growing corn or soybeans or cotton or peanuts, which are highly mechanized. One of the arguments we always have in Congress is with Steve King and folks like that. Steve King from Iowa that sits on the Judiciary Committee, and he'll back one of us or several of us into a corner, and he likes to get that finger going and saying, you guys, you don't get it. You're not good Americans, because he says, my farmers in Iowa, he says, some of them are farming 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 acres, he says, and it's just the farmer and his son and his daughter, and he says, when harvest time comes, the daughter who's a lawyer up to Des Moines and the son who's a surgeon in Chicago, they all come out and they help harvest. And they work 30 hours straight and they get the job done. This is honest to goodness truth. He says, and they don't hire a bunch of illegals like your people do. He says, your people need to go out and work harder like my farmers do. And you try to explain to somebody who has that mentality that it doesn't matter how hard you work in a couple hundred acres of apples, 3 or 4 people are not going to harvest them. And this is not going to happen. And we don't have combines for apple trees. We have kind of combines for blueberries and some things like that, but not the ones you buy in Costco and pay top dollar for. Those are the things that go into processing. They do harvest some nuts and some citrus, partially mechanically. Sour cherries are harvested quasi-mechanically, but even with all the mechanization that we've worked on over the last 50 years in labor-intensive agriculture, and for the next 50 years, I don't think we're going to have a robot or a machine that's going to pick just the right strawberry or just the right apple, particularly on varieties where you have to pick the tree over 2 or 3 times. We have mechanized cucumbers to some extent, and some crops like that, and some tomatoes where you have a machine that goes through and actually harvests the whole row. You only get one harvest on that. So all the cucumbers that are oversized, it's really, if you've ever seen it, it's amazing. All the cucumbers that are too big, they go out in the field. They just go back to the ground. The ones that are too small fall through and they go on the ground. And the only ones you get are the ones that are the right size to ship in truckloads to Clausen's or one of the pickle factories. And that's okay because they're grown that way and you only get one picking, and they're grown that way. The tomatoes that go to the canner are the same way. But the tomatoes you buy to eat fresh, the cucumbers you buy to eat fresh, the zucchinis you buy in the store, apples, those are all picked by human hands. It takes a lot of people to pick a small area. And that's the limiting factor for food production agriculture of that kind of food. And dairy is another perfect example. Dairy is increasingly, well, it's always been labor intensive. It's very mechanized. But even with the new automatic milking machines, you have to have a couple people there all the time. 24 hours if you're milking 24 hours. You can never just walk away, so you have to have shifts. I won't get into the whole issue of food justice and sustainability. I've written about that in a couple of my monthly columns a few times. Sustainability in agriculture is whatever the person that's defining it says it is. And if you're an organic grower, sustainability means one thing to you. If you're a conventional grower, sustainability means something else. If you're someone who thinks we should go back to 40 acres and a mule, it means something else yet. And so one of the things the person that I had the interview or the dialogue with last year, to him, sustainability was everybody growing 1 or 2 hectares of food for themselves and their families and just a little bit extra to sell. And my take on that was that's fine, but most of the world doesn't want to live that way. And for people as wealthy and as well-to-do and educated as we are to decide that millions of people should be destined to that, that's kind of elitist and a little bit wrong from my view. So we have this growing shortage of workers. The other thing we have is we're in the process of transitioning leadership in agriculture, in all businesses, in society, from the baby boomers to probably the millennials. That's the next big group. You know, where the Y's and X's fell in, they just kind of got lost in translation, I'm afraid. Because if you look at industries, you look at agriculture, it's the millennials that are the next group to take over from us baby boomers. And so far, we, the baby boomers, haven't done a real good job of figuring out how to transition ourselves out, much less how to help transition the millennials in. Partly because we don't understand the millennials, which is partly because they have very different desires and interests than we do, and partly because we haven't listened very well, because baby boomers are known for working 50, 60 hours a week, even when we're in our 60s, and one day we'll either just leave and retire or we'll just drop dead and leave all of our associations and businesses for the millennials. And I hope we do a better job of transitioning than a lot of my growers are. But one thing we're learning with the millennials is that I've got big growers, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 acres of fruits and vegetables, 4,000 acre dairy, 4,000 cow dairy herds. One who just bought another 5,000 cow herd in Colorado, and has a couple of really large herds in New York. Their millennial generations don't really want to farm. They'd like to farm, but they don't really want to do all the people management, and they don't really want to deal with all the regulations, and they don't want to work 7 days a week from dawn till dark till well after dark like mom and dad and grandma and grandpa have done. And so they're going and taking jobs off farm. Some of them are quitting the farm after a couple of years because they want to get married and have children, and they're taking jobs off farm, often in ag service, but off farm. And I've got baby boomer members now who thought they had the next generation lined up, and they've left in the last 2 years. So that's a big issue for Agriculture 2020. It will never be like an office or a factory job to be in agriculture where you punch in and you punch out, and if you're the owner or the manager or the operator, that you can forget about it over the weekend. But we've got to figure out how to get it so that it's more manageable, so that people have a life other than just working all the time. Because the millennials aren't going to put up with that, and they all want to live in Washington, D.C. or New York or Seattle or someplace like that anyway, and that's not where we are. That's not where the farms are. So I've painted a really broad picture, so it's time for me to start funneling this all down to where my piece of the ag world is looking and where we think we're heading 2020, and where we think that our allies and friends like ASHCA, like the Farm Medicine Center, the Children's Center, and a lot of other allied groups that aren't directly related to us but are trying to do a lot of the same things will kind of head. My role in NCAE, we are the National Trade Association for Food Production Agriculture. So we're focused solely on agricultural employers. Our members are growers of all sizes, some really large, some relatively small, but generally larger growers. Generally fruit and vegetable growers who are well over 250,000. Most of them, probably not many of my members, are much under about $500,000 a year in sales, which doesn't seem that big, but when we start looking at the statistics, it's a very small number of the percentage of the farms in the U.S., but those small percentage of farms produce most of the food that we eat here and that we sell. So we advocate, means I lobby, we comment, we educate the public, we educate our own members, and we try to educate government regulators so that they understand that ag truly is unique. OSHA, for example, will say, well, we just want to not allow anybody to work if the temperature's over 100 degrees. Well, if the temperature's over 100 degrees, that might be fine. People probably ought not to work. But if somebody doesn't maintain the dairy cattle and help them with that 100-degree heat, or the hogs or the chickens, you're going to lose everything. So somebody has to work when it's like that. We have to figure out how that can be done safely and properly. So, yeah. All right. NCAE was established 50 years ago. Last year we had our 50th anniversary at our annual meeting in 2014. And part of a big chunk of my role with NCAE now, we were bankrupt when I joined in 2008, and a big chunk of my role now that we're not bankrupt anymore is to figure out how to pass NCAE off to the next generation of leaders so that it'll be around for another 50 years, just like many of your farms and other associations are doing. So I'll discuss a list of issues that are barriers that limit the work of my members and their ability to grow their farms, to figure out how to pass their farms down to their next generations, and to feed those 9.7 billion people in 2050. And what it'll come down to is the number one issue is labor supply. I'll talk more about that, but labor supply is a current and growing issue. It's crushing fruit and vegetable production. It's crushing the dairy industry. It's crushing many other industries, and we don't have enough domestic workers, and so that gets us into a whole lot of other issues that we'll get to as we go along. An important thing for any DC association or any association when you communicate with your constituents and your allies is how to send and receive clear messages. And in Washington, D.C., that's particularly challenging. This slide I can't resist using because this is one of the Smithsonian museums where they're showing the culture of the growing of tobacco, and they stick a no smoking sign in there. Well, that's a communication issue. We're growing tobacco, but don't dare smoke here. So that's about as much sense as Washington, D.C. makes. And some of these signs, this is what it's like navigating the halls of Congress. Don't enter here, enter here. So it's really difficult to keep clear messages, and agriculture is made up of so many small groups and big groups. There are literally thousands and thousands of agricultural groups and associations. There are groups at the federal level. There are international groups. There are groups in every state, a lot of them doing the same work as groups in other states, and often sharing very different messages with their congresspeople. One of the issues we've been working on immigration reform has been that one state commodity group, say North Carolina, will come in and just beat up their senator about something and tell them, and the solution is to do ABC. And then Pennsylvania comes in and beats up their senator and says the solution is XYZ, and don't dare do ABC. And so we get Congress fighting with one another, and it's really hard. So I want to talk about some general trends and statistics to kind of ground us on where we are. In the U.S., there's about 3.2 million farms versus more than twice that in 1935. And that number continues to get smaller, even though there have been a lot of small and beginning farms being started. Many of them are very, very small, so we'll talk about in terms of size. There are lots of very, very small farms, not very many really big farms, but the money is coming from the big farms. There's about 2.1 million farmers. That's less than 6/10 of the population, and that's a huge issue for any of us that are doing anything in agriculture in the U.S. And just as an example, when the Affordable Care Act was being written, when the regs were being written for the Affordable Care Act, we went to HHS, Health and Human Services, and tried to sit down with them to explain how difficult this was going to be for agriculture because we have such a huge seasonal, temporary, and migrant workforce. And after one of the managers, one of the upper managers there, we talked with them, and she said, "Oh my God," she says, "this is going to be like working with Medicare and the Katrina evacuees." And I said, "Well, how did that work?" And she says, "Not very well." And that's how HHS sees the issue of migrant and seasonal workers fitting with the Affordable Care Act, because it's state-based, it was all, the legislation and the regulation was written assuming that people work in offices, in factories, and places like that where they come to work, they work in a location, they go home in the evening, and they don't change jobs or cities very often. And so when we talked with HHS, we tried to convince them, well, ag's unique and we really need your help. And one of the deputy secretaries said, "We'd like to help." She says, "But we're so overwhelmed with writing the regulations, getting them in place in time now." She says, "We can't really deal with agriculture." She said, "You guys are less than a rounding error." That's pretty humbling to be told by the federal government that you're less than a rounding error. But that's our problem with Congress, with federal agencies, and with society in general. Society has their views of what agriculture and farming is. And just to paraphrase a congressman, you walk in and we represent agriculture. "Oh, yeah, I know about farming. I visited my grandparents' farm every summer when I was a kid. They had 3 cows and they had 4 sheep, and I got to take care of the sheep. And the dog was with me all the time, and they had rabbits and chickens, and they grew tomatoes and corn, and we ate really good all summer. And Grandpa had like 200 acres of soybeans." And I'm thinking, that's not a very big farm. That's not the kind of farm that's feeding America or driving America. But if that's what a congressperson thinks about farming, that's what Middle America thinks. Middle America thinks of farms as the guy on Green Acres or something like that. You have 3 cows and they have names, or 1 cow it has a name and the pig has a name and they probably talk to you. That's scary, but that's the view of agriculture that America out there has. We're 5 generations removed from the farm now, is what somebody told me. Even just when most of us, and this is not a very old group, but when most of you here are probably only 1 generation removed from the farm, if you're removed at all. But most of America is now 5 generations removed from the farm. In 8 or 10 more years, it'll be 6 or 7. And that's a big risk for agriculture. That's something we've got to figure out how to address. And I don't know how to do it. We're a very small group, but we've got to address that to get the ear of people, because food in America is so inexpensive and so abundant and so good that people say, well, we don't mind paying an extra $1 a day for food if it means this or if it means that. There are a lot of people in the world that an extra $1 a day of food would make them decide which of their children has to starve, because that's what the world food supply is like. So there's 2.1 million farmers. We're less than a rounding error. The average age of the primary operator of a farm in the 2012 Census of Agriculture was up to 58.3. I'm told it's 60 now or better, because it was up from 50 already in 1982. It's 86% male operators, and that number has actually increased. I was surprised. That was the one number that surprised me. I thought that percent male ownership and primary operator had gone down with a lot of new and beginning farmers, because there are a lot of women among those ranks, but it hasn't. American farms are overwhelmingly family farms, regardless of what the media and some activist groups will try to tell you. We hear about corporate America, corporate farms. Those are mostly corporate family corporations. You have to incorporate for legal reasons. You have to incorporate to borrow money and to grow. And almost all farms that are economically viable units now are corporations. So even farms of $1 million or more annual gross sales are more than 85% family owned in the U.S. And they produce Farms that are $1 million or more produce more than 60% of all our total output in the U.S. of farm products. There's about 188,000 of the 3.2 million farms that are those $1 million or more. Only 188,000 of 3.2 are producing 60% of our food. About a third of the current 3.2 million U.S. farms report that they have internet. Now, that's kind of, well, yeah, because all the big guys have internet. Anybody who's really, truly economically viable has internet service. But when you're trying to push safety and health and food safety and things to those farms who are not big and already have an infrastructure, the scary side of that figure is that 30% of them don't have internet. So how do you reach them? I don't know. It's really hard in this day and age because print has become so crushingly expensive and so difficult to get decent coverage in. You almost have to use internet to reach mass markets now. So I don't know how we're going to reach those 30% of smaller farmers who economically might not seem that important, but numbers-wise, there are so many of them that if you're going to move the needle on health and safety and stewardship issues and environmental issues, you've got to reach them. They are very important from that standpoint because they're underserved. So just a little bit of a chart. Only 10% of total farms are $250,000 or more annually, and that's not a lot of money if you start thinking about supporting a family and paying. This is $250,000 of gross sales, not net, not profit. Doesn't leave a whole lot of money for income, but they are 80% of our food and fiber production in the U.S. 30% are 10 to 249,999, and 60% of the number of farms are less than $10,000. They're only 2% of the food and fiber production in the whole country. So, get back. Top 10 states: California, Iowa, Texas, Nebraska, Minnesota, Kansas, Illinois, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Indiana. If I changed that to show dairy, it would be a little different mix. If I change it to show fruit and vegetable, direct human food production, it would be a little different mix. But no matter how I change it, California would remain on the top of the chart. California produces almost half of all the fruits and vegetables and other tree crops and food that's eaten and sold in this country. They're a huge market themselves. They also produce well over half of all the nursery and ornamental crops. They're the biggest single state of consuming all those crops, too. So, the statistics for agriculture, to start to funnel it down to my world, there are about 1.5 to 2 million hired workers on farms. They might be hired full-time, they might be hired for 2 days a year to do some specific thing, but they're hired by the farmer. They're not the contractor that comes and fixes the tractor, or fixes the milking machines, or the veterinarian. Those are contractors, but these are people that you actually hire to do work. Over 80% of those workers, including the owners and managers, are men. Majority of hired workers in labor-intensive ag, the majority of them, the majority of the hired workers are in labor-intensive agriculture. A big grain farm might have 1 or 2 hired workers. A 100-acre blueberry farm, if you add 100 acres of blueberries, you will hire at least 100 more workers to harvest. Seasonal, but it will take at least 100 workers or so to harvest 50 to 100 acres of blueberries. It's hugely labor-intensive. And there's about 500,000 full-time year-round employees on farms, so that leaves 1 to 1.5 million seasonal, mostly migratory workers. Though migration is getting less and less, seasonals are more and more coming to a small area and staying, or they're being provided by the legal guest worker program, which I'll talk about more. Of those temporary seasonal workers, most of them work full-time during the season. They don't come and work 2 days a week during season. They work full-time, and full-time in most seasonal farm work is 50, 60, sometimes 70 hours a week because they're often paid production, and seasonal workers are only there for a short time. They can only be there for a few weeks or months. They want to work as many hours as possible because their goal is to go back home with as much money as possible because they have a very short season. The average farm worker, seasonal farm worker, only works about 6 or 8 months out of the year. That's part of the reason their income is so low. Their average income is only just a little less than $20,000 a year. But a lot of that's because the season is so short. Their hourly pay is often pretty good, but they don't have that many hours. So, These statistics raise important questions that ultimately should help us look for best strategies on how to make the best use of the limited resources we have, because we are struggling to have enough workers now to produce food for the people we have, and we're going to have to produce more food with probably fewer workers. So we need to look at these numbers to address policy and advocacy issues that NCAE works on, to address the education and safety impact issues that ASHCA is interested in, farm health issues that the National Farm Medicine Center is working on, and the child safety and welfare issues, because we have these different segments and we're going to have to serve them differently. One size doesn't fit all, and it's difficult because agriculture is already small enough, and then we're so diverse and so segmented that it's hard to figure out where to focus to get the most bang for our dollars. So key trends by farm size, we have kind of maybe 4 groups. We have very, very large farms. That's, for my members, that's like Torrey Farms in New York State. They have apples and dairy and fruits and vegetables and corn and soybeans and forage. And they have about 14,000 acres. When Maureen, my member, and her 2 brothers inherited the farm from her parents, it was about 1,500 acres. And they've built it into 14,000 acres. It's the biggest single farm in New York State. It's very well run. They just added another 3,000 cow dairy nearby in that whole farm area. They're scattered out over about a 60-mile stretch, and that's a very, very large farm. But it's a family farm. Their family owns it and runs it. There are large farms, which you see a lot of here, and a large farm, a 600 to 800 cow dairy is pretty large. That's a large farm. There are medium-sized farms, and then there are lots of really small farms. One of the trends that's very difficult is that, like American business, overall, the medium folks are the ones getting squeezed out. I'll talk about why more. But increasingly, you need to be very, very small, niche, or you need to be very, very large to compete and survive in business in America. And agriculture is indeed business. Yes, it's a lifestyle, but it's a business if you want to stay in it. We have trends by commodity. And by commodity, I talk about row crops. That's highly mechanized agriculture, corn, soybeans, peanuts, cotton, wheat. And some of those are more labor-intensive than others. Cotton is more labor-intensive than corn and soybeans. The cotton ginners actually participate with my association. The wheat harvesters have custom harvest crews that travel around the country, and they do fall under Department of Labor rules and things, and they might have 6 or 8 people working for them instead of just 1 or 2. Fruit and vegetables, nursery and greenhouse, and parts of livestock production are the very labor-intensive pieces. Fruit, vegetables, nursery, greenhouse, dairy, feeder beef is fairly labor-intensive, and the open range people out west often hire foreign workers because they can't get domestic workers. So, lessons learned. Size disparities. Most large farms are still family farms. They generally have the infrastructure for safety, environmental, labor, and other regulatory and legal compliance. That's a big advantage to them. After a certain point, when you become large, you hire a vice president of human resources. You have one of your family members that either does that or you hire somebody. So they can do industrial hygiene. They can do safety programs. They have a professional on staff who's been educated in that. They also either have on staff or they can afford to spend the larger numbers to belong to an association like mine or to hire a lawyer to advise them legally on the regulatory compliance issues. And that's a huge advantage to them because their cost per unit goes down tremendously based on those costs. If you have to spend $60,000 to comply with a new OSHA requirement or a new Department of Labor requirement, if you're a large farm, that's spread over many millions of dollars worth of sales over the next few years and thousands of acres. If you're a small farm, you might still have to spend that $60,000 to stay in business, and the blow becomes crushing. It just becomes crushing. That's why medium-sized businesses are the ones that are being pushed out of business by overregulation every year at the state, federal, and even local level, because they can't afford to comply. The dairy industry is a good example. There used to be lots of small dairies. My father-in-law raised his family on milking like 25 cows tops. And then he couldn't sell cans anymore. And he faced spending at that time $20,000 to invest in a bulk system. And he was 62, 63 years old. He says, I can't do this. He converted his dairy herd to beef over the last couple of years he farmed. because he couldn't pay the regulatory or the compliance load to switch to bulk, and there were no more canned dairies. So large farms will fall under most state and federal regulatory mandates, worker comp, unemployment insurance, Affordable Care Act, even much of OSHA, zoning requirements. You need to have 25 more workers, you're going to have housing for them. The question is, can you build the housing? Not can you afford to build the housing, but will your county or town allow you to put it in and give you an occupancy permit for it? That's becoming a huger and huger issue. Depending on what kind of workers you have, you can't just put up a couple trailers. The housing has to pass OSHA inspection in a lot of cases. It gets more and more complicated and becomes a bigger and bigger burden on the middle-sized guys. Commodity differences, most food and nursery production are completely labor dependent and will be for our lifetimes. So, large farms and producers are most labor dependent. They are the most highly regulated, but the per unit cost of regulation starts to become an advantage for them eventually. Because like other companies, I worked for the DuPont company for 25 years, or 20 years almost, after I got out of undergraduate school. And big companies can comply with regulations that medium-sized companies can't. It's the same thing. So labor availability, cost, and the cost product values and compliance are becoming the biggest limiting factor in food production. So much so that we're seeing more and more of our food production moving where the labor is available. Because farmers, I guess I'll probably say this again, farmers don't set prices, the markets set prices. Farmers take prices. There are some quasi-variances from that, but they're only small, and they don't work long-term. So the longer term, we're going to see more and more an improved mechanization, even in current labor-intensive crops. Mechanization for apple growers, for example, means you put your pickers on a moving platform so that the platform with them moves and goes up and down, and lower trees, smaller trees too, so they don't have to place ladders and climb, so that they can stand in one place and pick. It happens in the grape industry and in citrus increasingly too. That's mechanization, but you're still going to have 5 or 6 people on that platform and a dozen platforms in the field, because it still has to be picked by hand, and human eyes in a lot of crops have to say, this one's ripe, and this one won't be ripe until 3 days, so if we pick it now, it has no value. So that's mechanization. Farmers, regardless of size, don't set price. There are some quasi-differences in local and sustainable and fair food markets. You set price a little bit, meaning you can command a higher price as long as there are people willing to pay that higher price. If we were trying to feed 9.7 million people, we would be back to whether it was organic or conventional, the market would set the price, because Costco and Walmart and those guys are going to say, no, we will only pay $4 a box for tomatoes in July, because if you won't sell them to us for $4 a box, Mexico will. And they'll deliver them here for $4 a box. So that's what I'm talking about, that there are some small variances, and you will pay a small amount more for quality and locally, but in general, food prices are set by the marketplace, which means the big boxes. My members come in all sizes and all farm shapes. They tend to be bigger. They are also associations like Western Growers. A bunch of the state farm bureaus are my members. United Fresh and groups like that are NCAE members. Larger farms are very, very specialized. If you're a really large vegetable producer, you probably grow cucumbers and zucchinis. Some of the really big ones are very diversified. Torrey Farms in New York has dairy. They have about she says they're a very small apple grower. They only have about 400 acres of apples, so they're very small. But even if you ask her and she starts talking about it, well, yeah, they do specialize in onions and cabbage and cucurbits. And they grow a lot of other things, green beans and stuff too. But most vegetable and fruit growers will tell you, I'm an apple grower, or I'm a peach grower, or I'm a cucumber grower. And they might grow some other things, but they focus on one thing that they're really good at, and usually partly because of their climate and their water and their markets. So employers, and they are employers of both domestic and guest workers. Now, one of the things is I talk about domestic workers. There are 1.5 million temporary seasonal ag workers. Most of them are so-called, and I say so-called in brackets, domestic workers, because everybody that I know does a Form I-9 when they hire somebody. I guarantee that if you came to work here at Marshfield, you go to work anywhere else, you've done a Form I-9. You show up the first day and they say, we need to see your driver's license and your social security number. Now, they're not supposed to say that. They're supposed to say, and you better say, we need to see one form from Schedule A or one form from Schedule B and one form from Schedule E, or C rather. And Schedule B can be your driver's license or other picture ID, and Schedule C can be your social security number or your work authorization or about 5 other things. If you say as an employer, I need to see your driver's license and your social security card, you are setting yourself up for a discrimination charge and for being looked at really hard by USCIS, part of Homeland Security, because steering is illegal and people get caught in it all the time. But these employers, they all do their I-9s, and I'll tell you a typical thing, and it's worse for dairy than it is for the vegetable folks usually because they lose a bigger percentage of their workforce. But I know what happened to one dairy in New York. ICE came in and audited their I-9s and told the grower, it was another one of my members, well, Mrs. Farmer, we have really good news for you. We've been through your I-9s here for 3 days. You've done them right. You've done everything right. There are no fines. We've gone all the way back. You're doing a really fine job. And there's not many fines. Just keep doing what you're doing. By the way, 8 of your 12 employees are in the truck, and they're going with us because they gave you false documents, and we're taking them away from the farm. 8 of your 12 milkers are gone today. And that's happening all over the country because 75 or 80% of our ag domestic workforce is falsely documented. They are not undocumented. There are still people who hire undocumented people. They generally tend to be very small farms who still pay people in cash. If you're very big, you can't get away with paying people in cash anymore, and you can't afford to. You'd have to have a truckload of cash coming in every week to pay 1,000 people, and somebody would notice that. Believe me, you take more than $5,000 out of the bank 2 or 3 weeks in a row, they start looking at you. The IRS starts to look at you. That's how they've caught a couple of these people laundering money, government officials taking $10,000 in cash out and spending it. So you can't do that, but you do your I-9s, you have domestic workers, you act in good faith, you don't get fined, but you can lose your workers like that. And the Obama administration has deported more people in the first term than Bush did in 2 terms. So it's a big issue for us. So we have guest workers, they're legal guest workers, about 110,000 or 120,000 of them this year. It's still less than 10% of our workforce that are the legal guest workers. So we see growing regulatory creep. This is what ag employers and all farmers face, ag employers in general. We have new pesticide worker protection standards ready to be issued any time. We have a new notice of proposed rulemaking on pesticide applicator standards that has to be commented on by November. We have new overtime rules that we just commented on about 2 weeks ago, which will impact many of you because one of the big pieces of it is that the bright line for whether you can be called a supervisory employee, an exempt employee on pay is going from like $23,400 to $52,400 a year. That's huge because in small towns, most supervisors are probably getting paid something less than $52,000 a year. And that's going to push a lot of us and a lot of you into making a lot of your exempt employees into hourly employees and managing that so you can pay them overtime. You have mandatory overtime. We're seeing more and more OSHA rules and requirements. You think you're exempt from OSHA? You're exempt from inspections, as CAP would tell you. You are technically, or at least operationally, exempt from OSHA in most farming operations on your farm until you walk into the dairy barn, or until, if you're an apple producer, you walk into the packing house. But you're not exempt from OSHA no matter how big or small you are if you have an employee killed or sent to the hospital overnight. Who knows that if you have an employee killed on the farm or on the job, in any kind of a job, how soon do you have to report to OSHA? Does anybody know the answer to that? 8 hours. You have 8 hours to report to OSHA or you're in violation. And 3 months, 6 months later, they're very likely to come back and fine you after you've had a fatality and just make the pain that much worse. And it puts small farms out of business. Now, if you have, it used to be if you had three illnesses or injuries of your employees, three common illness or injury, you had to report. Now, if you have one overnight in the hospital of an employee, a paid employee, you have to report to OSHA, whether you're normally under them or not. We have growing environmental regulation. We have proposed changes to the farm worker housing standards. They'll come under a new standard, which is really not that much more onerous. It's just different. We have Affordable Care Act implementation and more. And since 2013, we've had 20 to 30% farm labor shortages around the country. What that means to food production in particular, well, what it means to all of you, is that people start to slow down their expansion plans. People that have 1,000 acres of fruits and vegetables plant 200 or 300 more acres of corn and soybeans next year because they don't have to worry about whether they can get the labor for that, and it'll pay the note, and the costs are a lot lower. It means that you have 8 blocks of apples if you're in Washington State, and a block might be a square mile, and you only have enough workers to harvest 6 of them. You're going to let the Red Delicious fall to the ground, and you're going to harvest the Honey Crisps and the Galas and the Fujis because they're worth a lot more. They're just worth so much more. You're going to harvest the ones that you can get the most money for. If you have blocks of tomatoes, you're going to harvest the ones that are most ripe at one time so you can make the most use of your labor. And my members are facing this every year. How much of their crops they're going to let rot and disc under so they can use their scarce labor to harvest what's worth the most and sell. And that's going on all over the country, and people are putting off their succession plans as a result. Tory Farms, as I told you, they put off their succession plan for 10 years. They finally last year added the 3,000 cow dairy and added some more agronomics so that a couple more of their younger generation, they finally decided, will come into the farming operation because they are figuring out how to get enough workers through the legal guest worker program, and it's working for them. When they were reliant on people who probably wouldn't pass their I-9 when ICE came, they weren't willing to add much more. So the single largest labor-intensive ag production state, California, has suffered drought really bad for the last 4 or 5 years, or the ag labor situation would be worse. The farm workers that used to work in California are picking apples and cherries in Washington State now, and Washington State's gotten along a lot better the last 3 or 4 years than they would have had California not had severe drought. They've even stolen workers from California. People will send buses down to California. How much are you making? I'm making $8 an hour plus production. We'll give you $10 an hour plus production. Come to Washington. And they do it. So growers and producers are feeling forced out of business, and they are forced increasingly to sell for mechanized crops and to move offshore if they can. We are now importing almost 25% of our food in this country, and it's growing every year because Mexico and countries like that have water, and they don't have as harsh they don't have the labor restrictions and the labor regulation standards, and they don't have the environmental standards at this point. So if they can get the capital to start a tomato farm, they can produce cheaper than us and ship here cheaper than we can produce. So NCAE's priorities are labor availability, worker eligibility, immigration status and guest worker programs, youth labor rules and regulations, employer health, safety and liability, health care implementation and mitigation, H2A, which is the legal guest worker program. What did I do? Oh, okay. I timed out. Okay. And preserving, protecting, and enhancing special procedures for H2A, which is a little too advanced for us to talk about today. We are working to oppose overregulation. We work to monitor the administration and the regulatory agencies to figure out where they're going next so we can have a chance to talk to them before they form their regulations. We are not anti-regulation, but we don't want regulations that put us out of business because they didn't understand they would put us out of business. The worst thing can happen is a regulation goes in and Congress says, oh, we didn't mean to put you out of business, we were trying to help you. And as we asked Mr. Goodlatte, the chair of the Judiciary Committee last year, why didn't you ask us how to help us then? Ask us how you can help. Don't just do something you think's right and it hurts us. So we support legislative changes to the Affordable Care Act that would lessen the burden on seasonal employees. The STARS Act thing, a lot of agriculture is working on, it would take seasonal employees out of scope of some of the employer mandates. So we monitor, we support and participate in coalitions, and we work to grow relationships with other organizations, which is why I love being here. They're not all ag trade associations. They're groups like this and all kinds of other groups, because since we care about agriculture, we can and should work together. Now, if you ask what we need for immigration reform, we've been working for some years trying to get immigration reform for agriculture as part of big immigration reform, comprehensive reform, which a lot of people say, well, that's amnesty, we don't want it. The only way to fix the ag worker situation, the only way to fix the Affordable Care Act, the only way to fix Social Security and Medicare and a whole bunch of things like that is going to have to include immigration reform, because right now we have 12,000 people or more who are working here with improper authorization. They're paying federal taxes, which they don't get to claim back. They're paying into Medicare. They're paying into Social Security. If they're working for anybody who is complying with the law, like all of our employers who are withholding from them, they're paying all that, but they can't collect. And that is one of the issues. That's one of the dirty little secrets in Washington. If we made them legal, we would have to eventually make them eligible to collect on those programs, and we wouldn't, the government wouldn't just get to keep all the money. And that's a dirty little secret, but it's true. We have to fix that, because under the Affordable Care Act, your workers, whether they are falsely documented or not, have to have insurance. They're under the individual mandate. But when they go to buy insurance in the state exchange, they'll get I-9'd or E-verified better than you can do it, and the state will learn that they're not really work authorized here and they can't get a subsidy. So they have to pay $600, $800 a month for insurance that all of your other workers, if they were legal, would get subsidized, and they'd pay maybe $100 a month for, and they can't get the subsidy. So it's another way of finding out that your workers don't really pass muster, and that's what's going to come down on us more and more in the next couple of years. You go to the hospital, they're going to find out that you're not here legally, and that's all going to get, even though HIPAA says it won't, believe me, the federal government agencies talk to one another, and they cross-pollinate a lot. They might not individually talk to each other, but people get into databases, and then ICE and other people notice that. They at least see the trends, and they start looking at industries. So we need our current workers to be legal, and we need guest worker programs that work. Government says that 50% of our 1.5 million people are falsely documented. When ICE comes and audits I-9s, it's really more like 75 or 80%. We are dependent on those. Not doing something about immigration reform, not letting us have our current workers find some kind of legal status, and finding a way for us to bring more workers in when they age out is going to kill more and more farms, and it's going to push our food production more and more offshore. Canada has really good guest worker programs. People come, they work, they go home, which is how ours should work. Tree fruits, raisins, those folks, it's horrible labor shortages. People are scaling back operations. There's a brand new study out from the National Milk Producers, just came out a couple weeks ago. 3/5 of the milk is produced by immigrant labor. And there's about 80,000 dairy workers right now who would be deported if we were actively deporting right now. About 80,000 of the dairy workforce. That's mostly the people that milk cows. That's the midwives and a lot of the herdsmen. A lot of the herdsmen. So we have long experience difficulty. The only program we have legal, H-2A, is very difficult to use, very costly, and at 120,000 workers a year, because the Department of Labor has a piece in certifying it, Customs Immigration, DHS, has a piece, the Department of State, and your state workforce agency, we're starting to reach the breaking point. If we tried to bring 250 or 300 workers in under H-2A, the pipeline would break down. It's just not big enough. They're not resourced enough to get all the paperwork processed and get workers here on time. If we lost our current workers, if we deported those 11 million people like Mr. Trump says he wants to do, we would need 1 million of these H-2A guest workers tomorrow for next season. Agriculture can't wait for that to work. You can't go out of business for a year and come back. You can't stop milking your cows for a year and wait for Congress to fix things. You can't stop picking apples and fruits and vegetables for a year and hope that in another year Congress will fix it. So right now, what we're doing in Washington is opposing all of the more enforcement bills being proposed because ag can't live with them unless they pass immigration reforms at the same time. So it's our limiting factor. We are soon outgrowing capacity. We have a group that works just with H2A at NCAE. We have a weekly call. Every week we have lawyers and agents and growers on talking about what's broken and what's difficult with H2A and which senator we should call or which person in USCIS or USDA or one of the other agencies we should call for help to make things work like they're supposed to, because there are breakdowns every week. In May, the Visa printing system broke down for 2 weeks. It cost some of my growers $500,000. The grower in New York I told you about lost $250,000 worth of zucchinis just because the H2A workers were 2 weeks late. That's out of her profit for this year. So we have this work group in D.C. called the Ag Workforce Coalition. These are the founding members, and there's about 80 or 90 other groups that have signed on. We work specifically on immigration and worker availability issues together. We go to Congress together, we go to USDA together, because we had not been staying on the same page, agriculture, and we were asking for different things. We've done a better job, but we haven't gotten what we needed. There's no short-term fixes or little fixes we can do. We'll continue to work to support adjustment of status, a better guest worker program, and a long-term visa program. What we told at our briefing last year we had with Congress was that you, Congress, you've got a choice to make. You're either going to fix the labor situation for agriculture and find us a way to have legal workers, or you're going to see our food production exported offshore. It's your choice. You have to make it. You're responsible. And so far, they're still too busy throwing rocks at one another in Washington, D.C., and maybe in 2017 it'll get fixed. So it's dependent on immigration reform, and ultimately Congress will decide. The American farmer is going to produce what they can produce economically, legally, and sustainably. If that means only mechanized row crops, that's what we'll do. And we'll do the best mechanized row crop production in the world. But it's a real shame, and I think a moral failure, if we don't produce food, too. So other issues for us, the Affordable Care Act implementation. If you're over 50 employees, next year you've got to be in compliance. If you have less employees, you might lose some because they do fall under the individual mandate, and you probably need to tell them that. We have child labor and safety issues, health, safety, and liability. Food Safety Implementation Act is going on. It's changed the way farmers work. It's a big issue. You have to comply with the Food Safety Act no matter how big or how small you are. It's a lot easier for big growers to comply with food safety and have a porta pot every so many feet in the field, and to have your water tested and your things tested than it is a very small grower. This is a killer for these new and beginning farmers, having hand washing facilities in the field and a porta pot in the field. It's a killer for them, and they're having a very tough time complying. So food safety, one of the good sides of the Food Safety Implementation Act is it's taken us tremendous distance in child safety, because one of the things we've been working for years on saying you should have a no children in the field policy, no children in the workplace, not just the field, on your farm. It's very difficult to get farmers to not only to do it, but to enforce it, because when your workers show up to harvest and they've got the kids, well, daycare closed today. You want me to work, or do you want me to take care of the kid? Well, the kid's in the car, the kid's on the edge of the field. Pretty soon the kid's in the field. Pretty soon the diaper has to be changed. That doesn't comply with food quality safety. So food quality safety is pushing children out of the workplace. In fact, it's pushing all non-employees out of the workplace, which is a good thing. Bigger employers had the luxury of putting those policies in place and enforcing them, even if it meant them sending their most important worker home that day. Smaller employers haven't had that luxury. Now if they want to comply with food safety, they're going to do that. So it's actually some advantage. Shifting consumer preferences and marketing control by major retailers is a big issue. The millennials want just food. They want local food, but they don't know what that means, and we can explain. Local food might be kiwis produced in California instead of New Zealand. That's local. Coffee produced in Guatemala instead of Africa. That's local. So, but those things change, and we need to accommodate to that. We have new OSHA reporting requirements. OSHA is coming more and more to the farm level. We have heat illness programs with OSHA, which are now law in many states, and I will predict will be law in all states or federally in another 5 years or so. We have new worker protection standard rulemaking. We have media, lots of media claiming that the ag workplace is totally unregulated. That's not true, but it is less regulated than some other workplaces, and they'll spin that to make it look like we're killing people wholesale on the farms. It's not true, but we're not as safe as we ought to be. So there's some truth, and there's a lot of room for improvement. We have continued media focusing on ag and forestry as the second or third most dangerous industry. And we have youth labor myths and realities out there. Responsible growers don't want and they don't need this kid in the field. It happens because the family needs the money. It happens because the grower isn't watching, or it happens because there wasn't any daycare and the kids had to be somewhere and the family felt they were safer there. And if you bring kids to the field, they're going to pick. Kids are going to imitate their parents. But responsible growers don't allow it, and they don't want it, and they don't need it. One of the things they get asked, well, how much would it hurt your growers if they had to stop hiring children? It doesn't hurt at all. In fact, it helps them. It helps them if it's enforced, because this is not a good labor practice, and we don't want this. We want this enforced. This represents a failure of the state and federal regulators. When little kids are working in the fields, this is a failure of the regulators, and we want our wage and hour Department of Labor folks enforcing on these guys and not just making life hard for those of you who are working hard to comply. They should be helping you comply, giving you education so that you can comply, telling you how to comply, and enforcing on these guys until it stops. So, other issues for this was supposed to be 15. We have minimum wage proposals. A number of cities have put in a $15 minimum wage, Kane County, Seattle, Washington. The governor of New York State just came out last week, says he proposes a statewide $15 an hour minimum wage. The Obama administration has long proposed a $9 an hour minimum wage, which actually wouldn't harm ag for the most part, because if you have H-2A workers, the adverse effect wage rate is at least $10 an hour, or $10.07 is the cheapest one out there, and not many people are getting by paying less than $9 an hour if they want to retain workers now anyway. But $15 an hour would cut to the quick and put a lot of people out of business. We're looking at mandatory sick and family leave. The administration, there's just a new rule came out last week, 7 days sick leave every year for federal contractors. A couple states have already started to put that into place. I guarantee more will start to put it into place within the next year or two, and it will become a federal law eventually. Unionization is cropping up more and more in California, again in particular. Workers' comp and unemployment insurance, about half the states require workers' comp for farm workers, about half don't. The rest will. If you hire legal guest workers, you are required to have workers' comp insurance for them and for your other workers. And then we've got lots of trade agreements. They can be a two-edged sword. We can require country of origin labeling so that other countries have a harder time sending their food here, so that when you go to the grocery store, you can see that that fish was produced and packed in China. Do I really want to eat that? Do I really want to feed that to my kids or not? That's the good side of country of origin labeling. The downside is Japan says, if you do that, we're going to keep your tomatoes. So it's a two-edged sword. But together, we can change things and make them better, and we can keep agriculture the great industry it is. We can keep it safe and productive and profitable. With the diversity in agriculture, it's really easy for us to run off in different directions. Just this room has a lot of diversity: dairy, fruits and vegetables, probably some beef, probably some sheep. Those of us who are agribusiness and not directly producing, and it's real easy for us to run off on our own and say, oh, I'll take care of mine and the heck with you. But we are such a small portion of the population. If we do that, I can guarantee we'll all lose. Remember the old Benjamin Franklin? After they all signed the Declaration, Benjamin Franklin said, well, gentlemen, we must now all hang together, or we will most assuredly hang separately. And that's how agriculture is. We will hang together, or we will hang separately. We're our own worst enemy. We are our own worst enemy. Oh, I don't do this. Those guys, go and get those guys. They're the bad guys. When we do that, we all lose. Let's hope that in the end, when it comes to feeding 9.7 billion people in the world, that Winston Churchill's saying was right, that the Americans will do the right thing, because I truly believe that the only way we are going to feed 9.7 billion people, is if the Americans, and that's all the North Americans, us and Mexico and Canada, do the right thing and step up and build the regulatory, environmental, and pricing and marketing structure that we are a major portion of that. Otherwise, people aren't going to eat. This really is, when I first started using this, I put the question mark. This is just a statement. This is all there is in Washington, D.C. right now. We had a good immigration reform bill in the Senate proposed last year. It was bipartisan. The Tea Party told Marco Rubio, "Oh, you're for amnesty, we're not going to vote for you," and he backed out of it. The House backed out of it, and we will not get immigration reform this year or next year through Congress. It just won't happen, because it's a perfect wedge issue for both sides, and they will both use their part of the wedge to beat up the other side, because that's all they're interested in right now. So sometimes it appears they're totally broken. We had a good bill. Now, you know, if you had any of you come to Washington, I will invite you to help. If you find this place, tell me where it is. I've been looking for it there for almost 20 years, and I haven't found it yet. I know it exists. There's a photograph of it, but I haven't found the brains yet. So the question I leave you with, is it right to play partisan politics with the world food supply? I think I know the answer to that, and I think you do too. We have some time for Q&A. You have my web address. I have cards for any of you that want. Please interact with me, ask questions here, send me emails, call. I respond to emails pretty well and would like to start a continuing dialogue with you. I apologize for going over time. I can't keep a sermon of 20 minutes either. It just doesn't work for me. Matt?
Frank, thanks very much. That was very enjoyable and informative. One of the things I think we were seeing at the National Farm Medicine Center is, as the evolution of small dairies become larger dairies, they begin to understand the importance of safety, which I think is lost on the smaller dairies when it's the single farmer and the single family working the farm. Is there any way we can accelerate that process a little bit so that we have a little bit more reach into the smaller dairies?
Well, some of it's happening because of market forces and regulation, which on one hand is unfortunate because it pushes them out of business faster and makes their life harder. On the other hand, if the goal is to protect the environment and protect people and to protect the food supply, you know, maybe it's not a bad thing, but it's a hard lesson, because you've got, well, of course, if you're very small, you're not selling to Costco. But if your food, well, you might be, because you might be selling to one of the big dairy companies. If your product is going to Costco and Walmart and things like that now, the person who ultimately sells it to them, the dairy, has to do huge audits, and they're getting more and more invasive and more difficult. And just a couple of examples on the audit for Walmart alone, they want you to certify that at least 50% of the milk, that the milk you ship to them in aggregate has been produced with at least 50% of the feed being produced under a certified or sustainable agronomic environmental protection plan, water protection plan, a proper agronomic nutrient management plan. That's what that's what they're getting down to. So if you're the dairy, you're going to check that off, but you're going to start talking to your growers, because ultimately Walmart might audit you, and if you're selling to Walmart or Costco, if you're the dairy or the packing house for the fruit, and you can't certify those things, they'll find somebody else who can, maybe in Chile or Mexico or Argentina, and goodness knows if they're really telling the truth or how you audit them, but you better tell the truth. You've also got wage and hour inspectors, because even small dairies increasingly will have to hire at least one person. So as soon as that happens, your state workforce agency may come and talk to you, and you've got to do taxes now with the Affordable Care Act and with more and more layers of tax reporting and things like that. The computers are starting to talk to one another more and more. So that's happening for those reasons. I also think that ASHCA and other groups are doing a better job. State organizations, the dairy organizations, the state farm bureaus, and the local organizations are doing a better job. At the same time, we're losing extension. I mean, the extension programs are decimated anyway at the local level, and they're still dropping like flies, which is unfortunate. But the state extension folks and some of the private companies and even those small farms have to buy insurance. The insurance industries, on some of those kind of training, the insurance industry is more and more starting to become, I think, extension. Not for agronomic or growing practices, but for, here's what you need to do to be safe enough for us to insure you, or you're going into the state pool and you're going to pay. If you're a small grower, you're probably paying 2 or 3 times per unit more for workers' compensation insurance than some of my growers like Duda Farms in Florida or Torrey Farms in New York. You're probably paying 3, 4, 5 times as much for workers' compensation because you have a lot of claims.
The issue with Obamacare is, if you're not a citizen, you can't have Obamacare. Is that the issue, or is it the issue if you have a work authorization, you can't have it? What would your answer be to this?
Well, it's several pieces. First off, because most of our workforce is temporary and seasonal and migratory, it's very difficult to do the employer mandate because the workers will come. You don't have to put them in the program for up to 90 days. If they're less than 120 days, you can exclude them. So where it gets to be a real mess is when you have your workers for 8 months. So they come. You cannot have them go into insurance for 3 months, and then you have to insure them. So you insure them. You have the I-9s, so they're domestic workers. You buy the insurance. You have to pay for it. There's some games. There's some very nasty games. From a moral standpoint, it's very difficult, and my members are struggling with it. Though economically, they're about having to do it. The game is that you have your workers, and it costs maybe $400 a month to buy insurance. So you don't have to insure them for the first 3 months, and then you're going to put them on your insurance, and you tell them, okay, you're not going to pick up $400 a month for insurance for your 300 employees, probably. So you're going to tell them under the CARE Act, you can't charge them more than 9.5% of their gross income, a couple things like that. But you're going to tell them, okay, insurance is going to be $400 a month. We're going to pay $300 of it, and you've got to pay $100. And we know that 90% of ag workers say, no, I'm not going to pay. So you say, well, if you want the insurance, you have to. And so they're going to opt out. Now, that doesn't relieve them of the individual mandate, but it takes you off the hook as the employer, and that's what's going on. So they still have an individual mandate, which eventually they're going to get caught up on. And last year, it was only like a $98 fine. Next year, it's going to be about $200, and it goes up until it's going to cost about as much as insurance. So if you do that, you get out of the mandate, and you don't have to pay a fine. If you tell them they have to pay the whole thing or don't offer insurance, you have to pay a fine for either not offering insurance or not offering affordable insurance. And some guys are doing that, some farms are doing that, but it's better to offer them the insurance, let them opt out and try to go to the exchange, and if they go to the exchange and opt out, even if they get a subsidy, then you pay $2,000 fine versus $3,000, which is a lot better. But we know that they're not going to be able to get the subsidy because 80% of them are falsely documented. They're going to go to the state. Well, first off, they're not going to go to the state because they're afraid to, because they're not going to put their documents under the scrutiny of a government agency because they know they won't pass. Most of them have driver's licenses that look good. Maybe they're actually real DMV driver's licenses because they took a Social Security card. But most of them have a Social Security card that really belongs to somebody else. And maybe several people are using that same Social Security number. So even if you go through E-Verify, they might pass because all that says is the Social Security card's valid. It doesn't say it belongs to Max. It might be Matt's Social Security card, but if Matt hasn't complained, it's mine. Okay. So they're flying under the radar that way. The legal foreign guest workers, the H-2As and H-2Bs, they fall under the individual mandate, and they can go and get a subsidy. But we can't get them to do it because there's a language barrier, and the state the state exchanges are so poorly run still that a couple of our apple growers tried to walk through in Connecticut with 5 or 6 H-2A Jamaicans. They speak English. They're English-speaking foreign workers. So they're English-speaking, which was one burden down. Call the navigator, because you have to do it one at a time. Call the navigator with a worker. I have Hiram Goodrich from Jamaica, and he needs to get into the program to get insurance. Well, the open enrollment period's closed. No, Hiram just arrived in the U.S. Well, we have to have a copy of his student visa. Well, Hiram's an H-2A agricultural worker. Well, we can't do that. So they call, Cecil Strongfellow, the Jamaican name is Cecil. And so they call with Cecil, and a different navigator answers, oh, well, very good, we need Cecil's documentation. He just arrived in country, and we can get him signed up, and it'll be $69 a month, and he can have full insurance. And that's what it's like. If you have 100 employees or 1,000 employees, you can't do that. And legally, you don't have to do that. The lawyers tell you you shouldn't do that. So legally, all you really need to do, and you don't even have to do this, but morally what you need to do is give your workers a piece of paper that says, here's how you go to the state exchange and access insurance, because the law says you have to have it. Well, these are the same H-2A workers who routinely get caught at the border when they come back for a visa in subsequent years and are asked, did you file your income taxes? No, we don't have to file income taxes. They told us we don't have to file. No, what they were told is that H-2A workers almost never owe income taxes. They are supposed to file, and they can be prevented from coming back into the country if they don't. So our concern is the next big time bomb on H-2A next year or the year after is they're going to get asked, did you comply with the Affordable Care Act? And they're going to say, no, I don't believe in insurance. Because Hispanic workers, in most about 80% of ag workers in the U.S., foreign ag workers, foreign-born ag workers, are from Mexico, and most of the rest are from Guatemala, other Central American countries. But culturally, they will tell you that if God wills me to be ill, I'll be ill, and if God wills me to recover, I'll recover. They culturally don't really believe in insurance. And so it's a cultural issue trying to convince them to buy insurance, too. It's a huge issue.
Connecticut's the best of the best.
Yes, it is.
And their navigators couldn't handle it. Other questions?
Cap?
Yeah, going back to this, the questions about transitions and beginning farmers and ranchers, with all these changes that we have to prepare for, all these difficulties that you've done a very nice job today of naming and describing to us. We're finally beginning farmers and ranchers. We're seeing an uptick in their population, 25 to 35-year-olds. And we're finally seeing some farms and some lawyers and some bankers figure out the transition programs that they need to introduce to their farms. But with all these volatility, should we or can we prepare and protect beginning farmers and ranchers and farmers in transition? Because they seem like they'd be particularly vulnerable if any of these disasters or crises should come about.
They are. They're very vulnerable.
They tend to be very small. In fact, when I was with the Latino Farmers and Ranchers organization last year in D.C., they had a group. They probably had 50 of those beginning farmers and ranchers in. The one guy I talked to was farming. He called it farming. 5 vacant suburban lots in Washington, D.C., and selling his produce into farmers market in D.C. And he was living on food stamps and subsidized housing. He's considered a beginning farmer and rancher. He's in the USDA program. That's not an economically viable unit. I don't think there's not a lot we can do to help him. I don't see him surviving. That's gardening. I hate to say it. There are some others who are really trying to make it who aren't going to. There are some who will. There are some who've been lucky enough to find somebody 70, 80 years old who really wants to see their farm carry on and has probably sold off a lot of the land, but there's still 5, 10 acres. 5 or 10 acres can be a viable farm, but it's only in labor-intensive agriculture. It's not in mechanized agriculture. You can do pretty well on 5 or 10 acres, particularly if you go vertical or grow in high tunnels. You can produce vegetables in high tunnels most of the year in a lot of the U.S. And if you're doing high value, top dollar, high quality, you can do it. But there again, one farmer and a spouse and 2 kids can't manage 5 acres of high intensity, you're still talking about a lot of employees. So the ones that are making it, I've also talked with the veterans group. A good friend of mine was the chaplain to the Vermont National Guard for 30-some years, and is very tied in with veterans groups in D.C., so I've been talking with them, and they want veterans to come back and go into farming and ranching, particularly some of the ones who are really damaged physically and with PTSD and stuff, because they can work alone, and as I've explained, that's a little bit of an issue because there's a lot of pressure in farming and ranching. If you lose your crop, you lose everything. And I don't know how good that is, but they're having some success. But it's been greenhouse bell pepper production, very specialized things, inside mushroom production, or some on even 10 or 20 acres, goat production to sell to the to sell meat goats to the Muslim population in big cities. Because there again, you can get top dollar. You can actually produce something that you know you can get top dollar to, because you can't, on those small folks can't afford to sell commodities. So I think some will survive. I think it's going to be a disappointing number, but more will survive because of the help they're getting from you and a lot of others than would have on their own. And the sad thing, however, is that not only is the regulation on them, but the next administration may just trash the whole program, no matter which side it's on. Because right now, this administration, actually, it's the First Lady that was a big proponent, and Vilsack, being from Iowa, probably wouldn't have had any thought of it, but it's a big deal to Vilsack because it's part of his mandate to make it happen. And they're doing a pretty good job making it happen. The question is whether it will be sustained by the government or not. We're horrible about that as government, as we do with a lot of our foreign affairs, to go in and start something, and about the time people finally start to get it, to walk away before they're sustainable. And that's what I'm afraid will happen. Other questions, Barb?
Well, I just wanted to ask a question. You commented about the big boxes like Costco and Walmart doing audits on farms for people that are supplying them. Do you have a sense in the future of whether or not they would be in a good position to promote some of the safety and health recommendations, whether they're voluntary guidelines, that we spend a lot of time trying to get them to the farmer?
They already are to a certain extent. They haven't gotten specific enough, but they're talking about labor. They're mostly thinking about people being short paychecked and things like that. They are big on child labor. That blueberry picture, that wasn't from the same farm, but one of the big blueberry farms in Michigan got on television. It's been a few years ago. I wouldn't have told it if it hadn't been like 3 or 4 years ago. But it was kind of typical. A crew was out on a block of blueberries, 5-8 miles or so from the home farm, and they brought their kids, and the kids waited in the car for a while. Then the kids were in the field, and then pretty soon the kids were picking blueberries and eating them was the story, but picking blueberries. In agriculture, the definition of an employer in agriculture is way different than it is. If you go into McDonald's and you pick up a piece of trash off the floor and put it in a wastebasket, you're not a McDonald's employee. In agriculture, if I go onto your farm and I'm standing there talking to you and you're loading seed sacks into a truck or something, and I start helping you do that while I'm talking to you, which we used to always do as salesmen, so we were told we weren't allowed to anymore. I'm your employee, even if you're not paying me, because in agriculture, the definition of employee is that you are, I'll get the sequence wrong, but you are suffered, allowed, encouraged, paid, or required to work. So if you come and work as a volunteer on a farm, and that's actually gotten a bunch of the organic farms in California, because the California Department of Labor is very aggressive at enforcement of everything. And one of the things that organic farms do is they do, well, not just organic, but a lot of farms do CSAs. The organic farms have been the pioneers of CSAs, the crop share thing where you pay the farmer $50 a month and you get a box of vegetables, or not, every month, depending on what grows. And in California, they do it a lot of the country, they do what they call crop mobs. And you get an extra box every other month or once during the summer if you come out and your family spends a certain amount of time pulling weeds. Well, 3 years ago, California Department of Labor started enforcing very aggressively, and they busted organic farmers out there for child labor and for failure to pay employees the minimum wage, because they got this extra box of vegetables that's wholesale value when they figure minimum wage. In fact, all of you, if you're farmers, if you're giving your workers, for example, milk to take home or produce to take home. If you value that, if they have to pay you for it or something, you can only value that at the wholesale value. And if they have to pay you for it, it brings them below minimum wage for a pay period, you violated the minimum wage rule. And wage and hour, federal wage and hour will work on that. So yes, they're doing that. They are really big on child labor, but the blueberry growers lost the right to sell to Costco for a year over that because the kids were in the field because there wasn't daycare for them, and they were out there and they just were assumed to be working, and the farmer couldn't prove they weren't. And that farmer had a no children in the fields policy but was not enforcing it. So the other thing that's happened is Dr. Weil, who's the head of wage and hour, he's a Harvard professor, University of MIT professor. He's actually a pretty nice guy. I don't agree with a lot of what he believes about our employment practices, but I like the guy. He'll talk to you. He'll defend himself. He spoke at our annual meeting last year. He's decided that federal wage and hour doesn't have the resources to look at all the farms. It's farms and hospitality industry that they're really looking at because there's the lower paid workers in the country. And so he's now starting to focus on trying to get Walmart and those guys to put more practices in place to have supply chain regulation. I call that non-governmental regulation. It's huge, and it's big in Europe. It's big in all around, and it's growing. And there's nothing you can't lobby against it. And if you're a grower, there's not a lot you can do about it. It's pretty scary. Other questions? I really appreciate getting to talk to you. I am so excited to finally got to come out here and visit with you. And anybody wants a card, I have a whole pocket full of them.